In the working-class town of Esplugues de Llobregat, just outside Barcelona, a boy was born on July 13, 2007, who would one day carry the weight of an entire nation's football dreams on his shoulders. His name was Lamine Yamal Nasriaoui Abana, but the football world would come to know him simply as Lamine Yamal. His story begins with two families, two continents, and one shared destination. His father, Mounir Nasriaoui, traces his roots to Morocco. His mother, Sheila Abana, carries Equatorial heritage. Their son would grow up straddling these identities, a product of immigration and ambition, born into a country that was still learning what it meant to be modern, multicultural Spain. His very name, Lamine, is common across West Africa and carries Arabic linguistic roots, a small but telling detail about the layered identity of the boy who would become Spain's brightest star. There's a photograph that football fans love to point to, one that feels almost too perfect to be real. In it, a baby Lamine Yamal is cradled in the arms of Lionel Messi during a charity event years before either could have imagined their paths would cross again on the grandest stage of all. It was a fleeting moment, a coincidence of time and place, but in hindsight it reads like foreshadowing written by fate itself. Yamal's football journey started the way so many great stories do, on the streets and local pitches, where he first touched a ball and showed signs that he was different from the other kids around him. He played for a local club before he caught the attention of scouts working for FC Barcelona's legendary youth academy, La Masia. In 2014, at just 7 years old, he was brought into the fold of the institution that had produced Messi, Xavi, Iniesta, and so many others who defined an era of Spanish football dominance. La Masia is not simply a youth academy. It is a philosophy, a way of teaching children to think about football as a language, a system built on positional intelligence, quick combinations, and technical mastery learned so early that it becomes instinct rather than instruction. Yamal grew up inside that system, absorbing its lessons on tight, closely cropped pitches, learning to receive the ball under pressure, to see passes before they existed, to treat the ball as an extension of his own body. Coaches who worked with him in those early years often tell the same kind of story, a boy who was smaller than his peers but who never seemed intimidated, who processed the game a half-second faster than everyone around him, and who had an appetite for the ball that bordered on obsession. He wanted to be involved in every passage of play, every possession, every moment where the game might be decided. The rise from academy prospect to first-team footballer usually takes years, sometimes an entire adolescence of patient development. For Yamal, the timeline compressed dramatically. On April 29, 2023, at just 15 years old, he made his debut for Barcelona's senior team against Real Betis, becoming the youngest player ever to appear for the club at the top level. It was a moment that sent ripples through Spanish football, a signal that something extraordinary was unfolding at Camp Nou, even as the club navigated one of its more turbulent financial and sporting periods in recent memory. His emergence could not have come at a more important time for Barcelona. The club was rebuilding, searching for identity after a period of instability, and here was a homegrown talent, a boy raised entirely within their own footballing culture, offering a glimpse of hope for the future. Fans who had watched the club cycle through expensive signings and short-term fixes suddenly had something different to believe in, a player who felt like theirs, shaped by their own hands, ready to lead the next generation. Barcelona was only half of the story. Just months after his club debut, Yamal was called into the Spanish national team. On September 8, 2023, he made his senior debut for Spain in a Euro 2024 qualifying match against Georgia. He was 16 years and 57 days old, making him the youngest player to ever represent Spain's senior side. Then, in the same match, he did something no one his age had ever done for the national team. He scored, becoming Spain's youngest ever goalscorer in a resounding 7-1 victory. It was a debut that read like a script written by an over-enthusiastic screenwriter, almost too dramatic to be believed. Yet Yamal was already showing the world that he thrived under exactly this kind of pressure, that the spotlight did not intimidate him but rather seemed to sharpen his focus. What followed was arguably the defining tournament of his teenage years. At the 2024 European Championship in Germany, Yamal became the breakout star of the summer, dazzling with his close control, his fearless dribbling, and a maturity that belied his 16 years. He was named Young Player of the Tournament, and more importantly, he was instrumental as Spain lifted the Euro 2020 pitches. It was a staggering validation of everything La Masia and his family had built around him. Off the pitch, Yamal remained tethered to the ordinary rhythms of a teenager's life even as his fame exploded. He continued attending school alongside his football commitments for a period, a detail that captured public imagination and reminded everyone just how young he truly was, even as he performed feats that players twice his age had never managed. Teammates and coaches frequently commented on his grounded personality, a boy who seemed unfazed by his own rapid ascent, still close with his family, still recognizably himself despite the noise growing louder around him. By the end of 2024, Lamine Yamal was no longer a promising academy graduate or a surprising breakout talent. He was a fixture of both Barcelona's first team and Spain's senior squad, a European champion, and one of the most talked about young footballers on the planet. But as remarkable as this rise had been, it was only the beginning. The years that followed would ask an even bigger question of him. Could he sustain this level, carry greater responsibility, and become not just a prodigy, but a genuine superstar capable of shaping the game's biggest moments? That question would define the next chapter of his extraordinary young career. There are shirts in football that carry more than fabric and stitching. They carry expectation, history, and the ghosts of everyone who wore them before. At Barcelona, no number weighs heavier than the number 10, the shirt worn by Ronaldinho, by Rivaldo, and most recently, for nearly 2 decades, by Lionel Messi himself. Ahead of the 2025-26 season, Barcelona made a decision that surprised even seasoned observers of the club. They handed that number to Lamine Yamal. Still a teenager, still growing into his body and his game. It was a symbolic passing of the torch, whether the club intended it that way or not. Messi had left Barcelona years earlier under difficult financial circumstances, and the club had cycled through several players wearing his old number without any of them truly filling the void he left behind. Giving it to Yamal signaled something clear. This was the player Barcelona believed could eventually stand in that same historical lineage, an academy graduate who might, in time, be spoken of in the same breath as the club's greatest ever number 10. Yamal embraced the assignment with the same fearlessness that had characterized his rise from the very beginning. Rather than being crushed by the comparison, he seemed to draw energy from it. Barcelona's 2025-26 campaign saw him continue to develop into what analysts increasingly called an end-product winger, a player whose game had evolved beyond mere flair and dribbling into consistent end product, goals, assists, and decisive contributions in the biggest matches. Barcelona won La Liga during this period, part of a trophy collection that, by the middle of the decade, included multiple league titles, a Copa del Rey, and domestic Super Cups, with Yamal a central figure in each triumph. His statistical and reputational rise was matched by his growing comfort with the pressures of fame. Yamal became known not just for his footballing brilliance, but for a certain boldness in how he carried himself off the pitch as well. He was unafraid to spar verbally with and showed a young player entirely comfortable inserting himself into that theater. Where some prodigies retreat from attention, Yamal seemed to welcome the stage, understanding instinctively that being a superstar in Spanish football requires as much personality as it does talent. Commercially, his rise was just as meteoric. Barcelona and sponsors alike recognized in Yamal a rare commodity, a generational talent who was also authentically marketable, young enough to connect with a new generation of fans raised on social media, yet already accomplished enough to be taken seriously by football's old guard. His partnership with Adidas became one of the most significant commercial relationships of his young career, and reports placed his overall transfer valuation near €190 million, a staggering figure for a player still in his teens. Barcelona, wary of losing him, had inserted a release clause reportedly near €1 billion into his existing contract, a number so large it functioned less as a genuine transfer valuation and more as a statement. Players a decade his senior. One of the most charming subplots of his rise involved his younger brother, Keane, just 3 years old, who became something of an internet phenomenon in his own right, frequently spotted on stadium camera feeds pulling faces and reacting with unfiltered childlike joy to his older brother's triumph. Yamal, when asked about it, spoke with visible affection, saying he hoped that when Keane grew older, he would look back with pride at what his brother had accomplished. It was a small moment, but one that captured something important about Yamal's persona. Beneath the record-breaking statistics and billion-euro release clauses was still a close-knit family, still a young man who valued the people who had been with him since Espligues de Llobregat. By 2025 and into 2026, Yamal's game had matured in ways that quieted some of the earlier skepticism about whether a player so reliant on dribbling and individual brilliance could sustain success at the highest level. He began to show more end product, more assists, more decisive interventions in matches that mattered most, evidence that he was not simply an entertainer but a genuinely complete attacking force. Pundits and former players who had watched countless prodigies rise and fall began speaking about him in more permanent terms, discussing not whether he would become a legend, but what kind of legend he would become. Legendary figures from Spanish football's past took note as well. Andrés Iniesta, one of the architects of Spain's golden generation and a World Cup winner himself, publicly backed Yamal to lead the national team toward more silverware. even as he acknowledged the brilliance of contemporaries like Messi and Kylian Mbappé who continued to dominate scoring charts around the world. That kind of endorsement from a player who had experienced the very peak of the sport carried weight. It suggested that those who understood football at its highest level saw in Yamal something durable, not simply the flash of a prodigy destined to fade, but the foundation of a career that could define an era. Still, questions lingered, as they always do with young superstars asked to carry outsized burden. Argentina legend Mario Kempes offered a pointed challenge, suggesting that Yamal still had plenty to prove on football's grandest international stage, that domestic brilliance for Barcelona was one thing, but true superstardom required replicating that form when a World Cup was on the line. It was a fair challenge, one that echoed the doubts every great young player has faced before proving themselves on the biggest stage of all. And in 2026, that stage was about to arrive in the form of a World Cup hosted across North America, one that would ask Lamine Yamal to do something he had never done before: carry Spain's hopes not in a qualifying tournament or a continental championship, but in the single event that defines footballing greatness more than any other. There was added intrigue in how the tournament would test him physically as well as mentally. In April 2026, deep into a demanding club season, Yamal suffered a hamstring injury serious enough to end his involvement with Barcelona for the remainder of the campaign. For a player whose entire game depended on explosive acceleration, sudden changes of direction, and the kind of dribbling that requires total physical trust in one's own body, the timing could hardly have been worse. With the World Cup only weeks away, the injury cast a shadow of uncertainty over what many had expected to be his crowning moment, turning a summer that should have been about pure anticipation into one shaded by doubt, recovery timelines, and the quiet fear that his body might not cooperate with his ambition. Every generational talent eventually faces the tournament that defines how history remembers. For Lamine Yamal, that tournament arrived in the summer of 2026, when the FIFA World Cup returned to North America for the first time in more than 3 decades, hosted jointly across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. It was the biggest stage football has to offer, and Yamal, still only 18 years old, arrived carrying both the hopes of Spain and the shadow of his recent hamstring injury. He had not played since the injury forced him out of the closing stretch of Barcelona's season, and there were real questions about whether he would even be fit enough to feature meaningfully once the tournament began. Spain's national team management, led by veteran coach Luis de la Fuente, made the decision to include him in the squad regardless, betting that even a diminished Yamal offered more than most alternatives, and that time and rest during the tournament's early stages might restore him to something closer to full sharpness. It was a gamble that reflected just how central he had become to the team around stars like Yamal, Nico Williams, Pedri, and Mikel Oyarzabal. Could not simply expect. Yamal gradually worked his way back into the side, and Spain's form improved considerably. They advanced one where Pau Cubarsi's defensive composure, Alexis Mac Allister's midfield engine for Argentina's rivals, and a rotating cast of attacking talents shared the creative burden alongside. Spain's semi-final victory over France set up a final that football fans across the world had quietly been hopping for since the tournament's earliest days. Spain against Argentina, Lamine Yamal against Lionel Messi, the symbolic passing of the torch made literal on the sport's biggest stage. It was impossible not to notice the poetry of it. Messi, at 39 years old, was playing in what almost everyone assumed would be his final World Cup, hoping to become the first player in over 6 decades to lead his country to consecutive titles. Yamal, not yet 19, represented the future arriving to meet the past head-on. The same boy who had once been photographed as an infant cradled in Messi's arms, now standing across from him in a World Cup final. The final, played at New York, New Jersey Stadium on July 19, 2026, delivered all the tension anyone could have hoped for, if not quite the same open, attacking spectacle some had imagined. Argentina set up cautiously, seeking to frustrate Spain's possession. Argentina retreated further into a defensive shape, banking on moments and set pieces rather than sustained pressure. Spain, as they had throughout the tournament, controlled the ball and territory but struggled to find the finishing touch their dominance seemed to demand. Yamal was heavily involved throughout, helping orchestrate attacks down the right flank, drawing defenders and creating half-chances, even as a golden opportunity for Nico Williams was ruled out for a foul in the build-up. The match remained goalless deep into the second half, then through all 90 regulation minutes, forcing extra time for the second World Cup final in a row. The turning point arrived when Argentina's Enzo Fernandez renewed urgency. Just 37 seconds into the second period of extra time, substitute Ferran Torres struck the decisive blow, driving home the goal that would ultimately win Spain the tournament. Yamal, exhausted but still influential in the build-up, had once again beaten defenders and forced a save from Argentina's goalkeeper Emiliano Martinez only minutes earlier, evidence that even a slightly muted version of his brilliance remained a persistent threat until the final whistle. When the full-time whistle sounded, Spain had won 1-0, securing their second World Cup title and their first since 2010, when a similarly narrow extra-time victory had delivered the trophy against the Netherlands. For Messi, it marked the end of a legendary international career without the second World Cup crown that would have cemented an already unimpeachable legacy beyond any doubt. For Yamal, it marks something different, not the culmination of a career but a milestone early within one, a World Cup winner's medal earned before his 19th birthday, a marker that will follow him through every remaining year he plays the sport. Individually, the tournament did not crown Yamal as its brightest star in the way many had predicted before a ball was kicked. That honor, the Young Player Award, went instead to his own teammate and countryman Pau Cubarsí, whose defensive consistency throughout the tournament proved more decisive than Yamal's occasional moments of brilliance. It was, in its own way, a fitting footnote to a summer complicated by injury and recovery, a reminder that even generational talents do not always control the exact shape their greatest triumphs take. Yet none of that diminished what the tournament and the years surrounding it had already established. In barely 3 seasons, Lamine Yamal had gone from a 15-year-old academy graduate making his Barcelona debut and now a World Cup winner, all before he turned 19. The story of Lamine Yamal is still being written, its final chapters far from determined. But its opening act, the rise from Esplugues de Llobregat through La Masia to World Cup glory in New Jersey, already reads like one of the most remarkable beginnings the sport has ever produced, a foundation upon which an entire era of Spanish and global football may yet be built.